We are back. Another solo episode. This one is born of a question I got on my Instagram Q&A. Daniel Edwards, shout out Daniel Edwards from Desert Barbell in Dubai, asked me this question. It was too long to fit in the box, and I told him, man, this actually would make a great podcast topic. So that's what we're doing. We're talking about it now. The question exactly was, what is the reason for the movement pattern differences at the top level between tested and untested lifting? And it was particularly around squats, but it's a fantastic question. It's like, why does technique look different? And especially if you start to look across different federations, different testing statuses, you might notice said differences. And I guess the first question is really, are those differences real? Or is there potentially confirmation bias? You think it's going to be that way, and then you look for reasons to find it. I think that plays a role here. But the first thing that springs to my mind as a discussion point is, and this is a little bit getting away from the question, but I will bring it back, so bear with me. Should we look at these elite level lifters for technical direction or technical advice? Like, should we look at these French squatters with the ultra low bar and the feet almost touching and the knees touching as they come up out of the hole, winning competitions, placing at IPF Worlds, that kind of thing? Should we look at that and go, okay, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there is ideal technique in this. And so we have to come back to the question is like, what is powerlifting? Powerlifting is a game of strength. It's about who lifts the most on the day. Duh. Okay. Technique is how you express your strength. So ultimately, the rubber hits the road when it comes to technique. Like, you express your strength via your movement. And so technique is the pathway to strength and expression, but ultimately it's also the bottleneck to strength expression. And so the question should be, are these people lifting a lot of weight because of their technique or in spite of their technique? And I tend to sit on the latter side of the fence. My question is always, when we see unconventional, less than ideal, less than what we might deem perfect or imperfect technique, my question is always, how much more could this person be lifting if they were adhering to what I deem to be the gold standard? So it's kind of the opposite. And this is an important way of looking at things. And you may not be able to take that road if you haven't had the experience of changing technique with high-level lifters, because it can be quite a daunting task. You've got someone who's really strong, and you think that it must be because of how they move. But a lot of the times it's the opposite. A lot of the times their strength is limited, or their strength expression is limited directly because of the way that they move. So that's just really an interesting discussion point that I wanted to bring up, because there are so many qualities that are going to lead to someone becoming the first place champion at something like an IPF Worlds. It's not just technique. There's going to be a huge genetic component. People are predetermined to be strong or not strong. There's going to be the training aspect. There's going to be wanting it. There's going to be so many layers to someone ultimately becoming the strongest version of themselves or stronger than everybody else. Technique plays a huge role, absolutely, but it's always a case of, is it the thing that's helping them or ultimately holding them back? And more than that, you have to be careful that you don't just look at that technique as a snapshot in time, which is very tempting to do. We forget how short the current lifespan of the top level lifter is, especially in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. People tend to come in to the sport and go out of the sport very quickly, whether it's due to stagnation or injury, or ultimately both. And so we have to ask the question, if the technique is affording some sort of advantage, which again, I'd argue against potentially, there's also the idea of longevity. Like, ultimately, if you have the genetics to be the strongest, you also have to withstand training over a long period of time to continue to get stronger. You have to have an element of longevity. And again, technique is how you express your strength, and therefore it is uniquely related to rate of injury. Whether or not you believe it, it definitely is. Technique has stuff to do with injury. And so we have to ask, is the technique also going to contribute to the longevity of the lifter as well? Anyway, let's get back to the heart of the question. So is there actually the variability that we tend to see if we are cherry picking? And again, my argument would kind of be against this. And so it can be harder to see that unless you're looking for the antithesis of it. If you're looking for variability in both tested and untested, you're going to find it. And as a whole, I would say that there's just variability in powerlifting generally. I don't think it is a tested or an untested thing. The thing is that unconventional stands out. So when we talk about the French lifters with the ultra low bar and the knees touching, it's very unconventional. It stands out like a sore thumb. You're not going to not notice it because it's very different. They tend to stand out from the crowd when they have unconventional technique. And when you start to look at some of the top lifters in the untested side of powerlifting, you do see some unconventional techniques there as well. You could argue that Julius Maddox, the biggest bench presser of all time, his bench technique is relatively unconventional compared to a lot of the other top benchers, both tested and untested. He has a relatively close grip. He's got quite an aggressive, messy, loose kind of bench technique. So compare him to his predecessor, Kirill Sarachev. Kirill's bench press was locked in. It was very tight. It was very smooth, very controlled, a super light touch, perfect technique in terms of maintaining shoulder position, where Julius Maddox is very like dump and heave, very loose, very close grip. It's kind of unconventional for a top-level bencher. Regardless of body weight, regardless of tested or untested, it's a little bit unconventional. Look at the best deadlifter in powerlifting ever, Danny Grigsby. Danny Grigsby's got a relatively unconventional technique. Pun intended. He's deadlift sumo. But his sumo is extremely wide. He's got a unique way of like levering and wedging into position. I hate the word wedging, but I just said it. He's got a unique way of levering into position. It's quite different. You don't see a lot of people emulating that technique. Look at Yuri Belkin and a lot of the other old school Russian lifters like Pozdiv, like Belayev. They've got that ultra close grip, wrist cocked right back, bar like really resting on their wrists and hands when they're doing squats. Yeah, that's relatively unconventional. Look at Dan Bell. Dan Bell's got an interesting squat for a big dude. He's got a very close stance. He's got those bow legs while he's going down. Milanichev, I mean, he was the greatest powerlifter of all time for a long time. His deadlift was like this weird-ass semi-sumo kind of deal, but he pulled 400 with it. John Hack. John Hack is arguably one of the best powerlifters ever on the planet. His squat is quite unconventional. He's squatting high bar. He's squatting close stance with elevated heels. It's kind of a weird squat. The list kind of goes on. And so the point here is that you'll find unconventional if you're looking for unconventional. It does stand out. There's variability between both tested and untested. The point of body size has been raised, and this is especially the case. So if you're a tested powerlifter, particularly in the IPF, just the nature of how the IPF is, you tend to be kind of tunnel visioned into the IPF. You don't really go looking and hunting for lifters outside of the IPF then as a result. And so your exposure to non-IPF lifting tends to be the standout lifters, tends to be when there's some sort of major record broken. And so a lot of the times this is from the bigger lifters, like bigger in body size. And people who are bigger in body size, you get what's called body proximation. So things just hitting other things, and things hitting other things provides automatic stability. Add to the fact, I mean, you could play this argument, it's kind of weak, but it's also kind of true. People using performance enhancing drugs have increased rate of muscle tone, so they're just tighter in general. They tend to be a little bit stiffer, a little bit less mobile, and as such, they tend to appear quite stable in terms of like that you're not going to get a lot of joints moving around. So like combine all of those factors, you get exposed to like Dan Bell doing a squat, and then you look at a 60-kilo French lifter in the IPF. The squats are going to look very different just by virtue of the fact that the people and the circumstances are very different. And that can paint this picture that there is huge variability between the tested and untested side of powerlifting. But if you were to draw a similar comparison, a 60-kilo female in the IPF versus 160 kilo, 180 kilo male in an untested division, it's kind of an unfair comparison. If you pulled 260 kilo females, you might see something that resembles a more familiar technique. And so we have to make sure that when we're having this discussion, that we're drawing a fair argument between the two sort of categories that we're looking at. The main thing that I want to talk about here, actually on the point of body size as well, if I pick on two zero lifters, so we've got Dale Longfoot and Chris Pugh, arguably two of the best weightlifters ever. You know, both of them are sitting in sort of like top 100 lifters of all time, top 100 male lifters of all time. On dots, they're actually one after the other in open powerlifting. So Chris has gone in the high 800s as an 82.5 kilo lifter. Dale has gone 912 as an under 90 kilo lifter. So both extremely strong guys. And again, even if you compare those two guys to, say, Dan Bell or Vlad Alhazov or Milanachev, you know, very big lifters next to not so big lifters, you're going to see the same variability in the technical breakdown of all three lifts, but especially the squats. So really what this comes down to ultimately, in my opinion, is cultural differences. So a lot of the technical variability that you're going to see between tested and untested, in my opinion, ultimately boils down to the fact that there are cultural differences in terms of aspiration to be certain types of lifters. And so there's just like the nature of IPF and how it's set up, especially with Article 14 and not being able to coach and compete across federations, you kind of almost get cultish groups in the IPF. I mean, you get that in any faction of powerlifting, but there's a lot less cross-lifter, cross-federation mingling. And as a result, you'll see people really emulating the technique, the style of lifters that they want to be. Like, think of how in the last 3 years, the whole like floppy arm before deadlift style has infiltrated the lifting world. There's literally no function to that. People have just been watching other lifters do it and then they start doing it. And so it's the cultural influence that's ultimately going to determine, in this case, the variability, in my opinion. People are watching their favorite lifters compete at IPF worlds. They're only really exposed to that if they're in the IPF. They don't tend to look outside of the IPF very much, so they don't get exposed to other styles, other techniques, other opinions. And as such, they tend to follow what they see and what they hear, what they digest, and you get the flow-on effect of everyone doing kind of the same thing. And you see the same sort of like cultural impact outside of the IPF as well. So it exists on both sides of the fence. The variability is probably not as prominent as it can appear, depending on how you're exposing yourself to the world or the worlds of powerlifting. But it's an interesting topic to unpack. It's been fun to sort of think about, to have discussions with Daniel when he raised the question, and to mull over while I've been in sort of preparation for this podcast. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Send me a DM. Let me know what you think. Drop a comment on YouTube or whatever. Really curious to hear what everyone thinks on this particular subject. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.